All right, everyone, thank you very much for joining me for the very first Planet Critical Roundtable. It's such a pleasure to have you all here. We are strapped in for a long session. On that, what I would ask is that everybody introduce themselves when given the opportunity to start talking. So for the panelists, that's when you begin your presentation. And for everybody else, when you're jumping in with a question or a discussion point or whatever, please introduce yourself, your institution, your background, etc. Keep using the chat as it is already in full flow. Feel free to pop down questions there as well throughout, use it as a kind of note-taking space. What I would ask is that during the presentations, we let the speakers talk for their 20 minutes, and then we use the 15 minutes thereafter to engage in a discussion. This is an interdisciplinary panel, so the idea is to troubleshoot one another's ideas, to add extra layers of knowledge, to call out what you think would be feasible or unfeasible, because the idea is to find solutions that are implementable for the polycrisis that we find ourselves in today. So yes, thank you all for joining. I'm going to hand over the conch now to Carey, who is our first panelist. Thank you, Carey.
All right. Thanks, everyone. My name is Carey Keene. I am a research scientist and assistant director at the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin, and I studied energy and economy interactions. And highlighted here is there's a book that came out about 2 years ago now called The Economic Superorganism, and a lot of the ideas I express here are expressed in the book, but perhaps with a few others. So I'm here to talk about Jevons paradox, or what's often called the backfire effect. So this is the idea that increased energy efficiency levels actually lead to more growth and consumption, say, of energy rather than less at the large scale. So this is essentially a 150-year-old idea, originated, named after William Stanley Jevons, British economist. And the idea was brought up in his book, The Coal Question, 1866. So in the Coal Question, he states it's a holy confusion of ideas to suppose that the economical use of fuel is equivalent to a diminished consumption. The very contrary is the truth. So that's a summary of the quote unquote paradox. It goes on to say, as a rule, new modes of economy will lead to an increase of consumption. It means kind of overall at the system level. So we'll go into that. So one of his kind of main example that he goes over in the book is about coal use and early industrialization in England. So he says, if the quantity of coal used in a blast furnace, for example, be diminished in comparison with the yield. So if you use less coal to make iron, a unit of iron, then the profits of the trade will increase. New capital will be attracted. Price of pig iron will fall, but the demand for it will increase. And eventually the greater number of furnaces will more than make up for the diminished consumption of each. So the key here is essentially this last bit. And this is what sort of gets people hung up on buying into this idea. So eventually the greater number of furnaces will more than make up for the diminished consumption of each. So it's not a ceteris paribus kind of situation. It's that you accumulate more things over time, and then accumulating more things over time leads to more total consumption for the total system or total economy. So you can generalize this. So the quantity of energy in some kind of widget, now say at the micro scale, right? The individual widget if you make that more energy efficient, then the price of the service from that widget will go down, and people will be able to afford more widgets and will make more widgets. And then the sum of all the widgets at the macro scale or the entire economy will more than make up for the diminished consumption of each individual widget because you've accumulated more. So that's the general idea. At the micro scale, it seems like you're saving energy, but the larger you expand your boundary, you're able to accumulate investment and into more capital. So the following have been true since industrialization to the current times, that the global economy includes more efficient processes. We invest in more efficient things, not less efficient things, and as a general rule. And the economy has increased its rate of energy consumption, has increased its size in terms of machines and population. So to understand this, you kind of have to have this micro to macro scale perspective. And one way to understand macro and micro scale perspectives or system perspectives is to think about size and the structure of something. What is the system size and what is the structure? One way to think about these two ideas is to think about three other ideas, which is matter, information, and energy. So matter is essentially how much is there, how much stuff do you have. Information is roughly how do you do it, or how is the matter arranged. And energy is roughly how much effort does it take or how much does it cost to arrange the matter in a particular way? These can be thought of as similar ideas at some core level, but these are three useful ideas to keep separately. So energy is essentially, in this sense, sort of a cost metric. So ever since the 1930s in the biological realm, Max Kleiber sort of established this relationship between metabolism B on the left of this equation and mass on the right of this equation it's a proportionality for animals. And you notice that these were not linearly related. They're related by this exponent 3/4 power. So if you have 10 times mass of an animal, or an animal that's 10 times larger, it does not consume 10 times more energy as for its metabolism, consumes or its basal metabolism 10 to the 3/4 power, or about 5.6 times more energy. And people have tried to understand the basis of this sublinear scaling in some sense ever since. And there's a lot of work done in the 1990s and 2000s since to understand this. The interesting thing is that this also holds for social insects, or what some people would call ultra social insects like ants and termites. So here's ants. And if you calculate the mass of ants as well as the mass of their fungus, if they're fungus farming ants, which are also on this list, which are farming ants, then you also have this sublinear scaling relationship. If you have 10 times more ants and fungus, you don't have 10 times more metabolism, you have less than 10 times more metabolism. So a lot of people look at these and they think, well, that's more efficient, but we're going to get into whether this is a conscious choice of becoming more efficient. If we go even sort of further down to the single cell level, you might have different kind of relationships. So I'm just going to highlight how size seems to matter here. So if you're really small, like a bacteria, that's just a single cell prokaryote, then they have superlinear scaling. So this exponent of mass, if they have 10 times more massive bacteria, it consumes even more than 10 times the energy as the smaller bacteria. If you get a little bit larger, but still a single cell, so protist, which is a eukaryotic cell, so these are things like amoebas or paramecium, then you'll have roughly a linear relationship. 10 times bigger amoeba roughly consumes 10 times more energy. And then we get to larger multi-cell organisms like animals. And this is the situation I already summarized as a sublinear scale. So size seems to matter in terms of what this scaling relationship is between size and energy, at least for animals. And so this is a summary of that. And we could think, well, if we go for this size relationship, in some way, you might consider this increasing coordination of the parts, which is to say, once you add multiple cells together, then they have some type of coordination. Some cells do one job, some cells do another. If you accumulate more and more ants, some ants are doing a particular job at any particular time or some sort of task, and some ants are performing another type of task. They're not all performing any one of the tasks at any one time. They become specialized, if you will, in some sense. So this also happens in the economy. And so this is part of the question to ask: if we have specialized roles in our human economy, how much of this is driven by just growth in general, or some sort of necessity for being larger? You could also ask if this means that there's decreased agency of each part. They have less free will, if you will, or less choice about what they're doing. So this is the catch. So, so the summary, some of you might have read and other things, is that the global economy has similar types of patterns, and that's why we might call it a superorganism. Some people do. The economy takes in materials just like animals, uses them to grow, and uses them to organize itself. And this is data on the right side for global primary energy versus GDP as a proxy for size. And from 1900 to 1970, it's roughly a one-to-one relationship, like an amoeba, you might say. 10 times more GDP, we consume 10 times more energy consumption or global power. And then after the 1970s, it changed into this sublinear scaling relationship. So you might say, well, the economy became large enough, like a multi-celled organism and more connected globally, and it ended up in this sublinear regime where GDP may go up 3% a year and energy consumption goes up 2% a year. So this 2/3 factor. So again, biology and economic data seem to roughly be telling us the same thing in terms of the trajectory of growth as the economy or the global economy grows, similar to if an animal or an ultra social insect society also grows. So we had this quote earlier from Jevons, and we're saying maybe it holds for animals and ant colonies and economies. So I'm just kind of substituting it in here just to be more generic. If the quantity of energy used at the micro cell in a biological cell or a car or a building at the micro scale becomes more efficient, then new capital will be attracted, and the cost of another cell, adding that to the animal, or cost of adding another car to the economy or another building to the economy will fall. And eventually the greater size of the animal or size of the cities or size of the economies will more than make up at the macro scale for the diminished consumption of each individual item. So it's almost as if that's a requirement. In order to grow at some level, you have to have more efficient devices, not necessarily more efficient devices, but each device is going to have to consume less, whether it's more efficient or not. And so this is just a restatement of what we've already said here. All right, so I hinted at this, so this is to spur discussion. How would you think of human agency and whether you have delusions of what we're in control of? It's not necessarily my area of expertise, but I tend to think of it as this way. How many degrees of freedom or options do we have? When we have so many options of things to do within the economy, where it becomes confusing as to what our restrictions actually are. So a 1 degree of freedom system in sort of an engineering sense is on the left, which is a bar pinned at the center, and it rotates. It only has 1 degree of freedom because it only needs one dimension to describe its position, which is, say, the angle of the bar. If you put a pencil on the end of the bar, it can only draw a circle. So that's the only thing that can happen. The pencil can only be somewhere in a circle, and that's a one-dimensional construct, so it has 1 degree of freedom. If you have 2 bars and the second bar on the right is connected to the end of the first bar, now you have a 2 degree of freedom system because there are 2 angles that are needed to describe where the pencil is. And now the pencil can fill up anywhere within this larger circle, a 2-dimensional space. So now it's a 2 degree of freedom system, and you need 2 pieces of information to describe where the pencil is. So this is just a simple example of increasing degrees of freedom. And of course, today we have, I'm not sure how to quantify the degrees of freedom within the human economy. So individual free will then is kind of unclear on many levels. So at one philosophical level, to survive, let's just say it's humans, biological creatures, have to eat. So that's sort of not debatable, but we do have choices for food. So it's not like we don't have no choice, but some choices are restricted if you want to survive. But so at a practical level, we think about designing machines and running the economy. We cannot create a perpetual motion device. Of course, we had to understand that concept first. So we're restricted by laws of physics, or what we understand is the laws of physics. There's also choices affected by other agents or influenced, right, by lobbying, advertising, and law. So we're not like complete automatons, but there are things that affect how we might operate as affected by other people like ourselves, and laws that we try to understand that are in some sense not affected by ourselves, but we try to interpret them. So one way to think about this is Richard Adams, who was an anthropologist, and then in a book in 1974, he discussed the idea of the control of the environment as a link to the power that you might have in social relations. So human relations. So he says it is the actor's control of the environment that constitutes the base of social power. So summarize kind of what he means here. This is his diagram from his book. Consider social entities A and B. This would be like countries. I just think of these as 2 different countries of the world, and they have some social relationships between the 2, and they both can control the environment X to some degree. So he says, well, A and B have equal control over the environment, then neither necessarily has social power over the other. They're sort of social equals. Control over the environment could be weapons, warfare, could be extracting energy or natural resources or converting them from one form to another. It's kind of a real high level concept here. So if A has more control over the environment than B, it can also have social power over B. So in a current context, we might think, okay, there is Russia that is A, and it has some oil and gas resources and military power. And then there's Ukraine, which has less military construct. And there's Europe, who is historically dependent on oil and gas from Russia. And this creates this social conflict, sets up the social relations to a large degree. We could think about this outside of geopolitics, energy companies and consumers. There's energy companies that's what they do, is extract things from the environment, and consumers, we sort of by definition is the group that consumes it. So we can think about these kinds of social relations. Historically, one of the good examples, at least in the United States, and not too far back in history, is that coal miners had control of the environment before there was a lot of automation in the sense of going down into the mines and extracting coal. And in the late 1800s, U.S. coal miners went on strike 2 to 3 times more than workers in other industries, and they created improved working conditions. And so this is from a book, Timothy Mitchell, Carbon Democracy. He says the strikes of the coal miners became effective because of the flows of carbon that connected the chambers beneath the ground to every factory, office, home, or means of transportation. So if the coal miners didn't physically go down there, control the environment, and bring the coal out, then there were so many other aspects of the economy that were going to be disrupted that the coal mine owners essentially had to give in to the coal miners' demands because there were so many other people dependent on them. So this is an example of, essentially the effectiveness of strikes and restricting, affecting the control of the environment, a physical thing to have to then translate to the social organization of the economy. So we'll go here now to the maximum power principle and how we essentially sort of do or don't make decisions, I guess. And so the maximum power principle can probably be attributed originally to Alfred Lotka in the 1920s. I didn't exactly use the term, but then Howard Odum, an ecologist in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that thought about this concept much more. So Odum's summary here is the maximum power principle says that the more lasting and hence more probably dynamic patterns of energy flow or power, including the patterns of living systems and civilizations, tend to transform and restore the greatest amount of potential energy at the fastest possible rate. So in the sort of natural selection evolution context, organisms that survive via natural selection are those that follow the maximum power principle. This would be the hypothesis here, the posited idea, so that more resource consumption leads to more fitness, and then more fitness leading to more reproduction and propagation of the genetic material. So this is the idea. He goes on to say, Howard Odum, when ecosystems and the systems of humanity are similarly diagrammed, the patterns of systems energy are found to be similar. So the scaling laws I showed earlier are one example of these similar types of patterns. Goes on in the middle of this quote to say, individual choices, say by you and me in the economy, are a means for exploring alternatives so that humanity as a whole finds the patterns that maximize the system's energy flow. After that, at the end, most people are accustomed to thinking of human behavior as the cause of behavior of the larger systems. They have difficulty realizing that patterns of the system can draw from the individuals the behavior that helps the system track maximal power through competition of variant patterns for survival. So I'll bring that back up. But what he's saying is we think we make decisions at the micro level and then sum these decisions up and it affects what the macro level economy does. He's saying it's hard to understand, but what's likely happening or what tends to happen is there's some larger construct at the macro scale that essentially dictates in aggregate a pattern of behavior at the micro scale, or what scientists might call downward causation. Karsten Hermann Palaf is an economist, philosopher in Germany, and he tacked onto this idea. So he's saying here that the maximum power principle is a principle of natural selection, also operates for all extensions, such as in technology or whatever we might call technology in the economy. And so he says, this means that a steam engine, for example, together with the human agent using it, is just another manifestation of what he calls a physical inference device, something that interprets the world and makes a decision. So a steam engine is another manifestation of physical inference devices, which evolve, for example, in the direction of higher efficiency. Higher efficiency follows the maximum power principle in the sense of maximizing work output. So, for example, here, kind of going back to Jevons and steam engine, ultimately the steam engine is just one way to increase the steepness of the gradient of energy dissipation and hence entropy reduction. So he's saying technology, how do we know technology isn't just something that has been evolved in the natural selection evolutionary sense? If we invented technology, what's the difference between biological natural selection? So this could kind of take you to ideas of, political will, or how do you organize yourself to achieve a goal, for example, like carbon emissions mitigation and reduction, all kinds of battle over isms, should we have capitalism, communism, socialism, what's neoliberalism? Put your blank in before ism and discuss it. We can pontificate if one of these is preferred from the standpoint of natural selection and evolutionary pressures, as Carson Herman Balaf is kind of implying. Is one of these more of a product of natural selection than the other? Because we come up with the ideas and we are a product of natural selection ourselves. So just to highlight here neoliberalism as what might be thought of as a current paradigm. This is just a quote from Philip Borowski, who studies this a bit. So the distinguishing characteristic of neoliberal doctrines and practices is that they embrace the prospect of repurposing the strong state, so state government, federal level governments, using governments to impose their vision of a society properly open to the dominance of the market as they conceive it. So it's about using markets as information processors, as they say, to promote in some sense, the companies, the capitalist doctrine, or promote profits, but using markets instead of other means for decision making. And so neoliberals from Friedrich Hayek to James Buchanan all explicitly proposed these kind of policies to strengthen the state. So we go back to Howard Odom. He says the people have difficulty realizing the patterns of their behavior might be drawn from the larger system. I just kind of put this in here to make a tie. So if we kind of add the capitalism or neoliberalism sort of framework here, we would say, well, people have difficulty realizing that the patterns of economic markets and using those as a decision-making structure can draw from the individuals the behavior that helps the system track maximal power flow through competition of various patterns for survival. I've added measured as profits from adding new degrees of freedom that enable more economic work output, right? This is what technology is at some large degree, is adding degrees of freedom that enable the economy to do more work. So that brings me to the concluding part here. What does it mean to express human agency in this type of environment? We have agricultural societies, as it kind of highlighted in John Gowdy's book that came out this year, Social. Agricultural societies, I mean, humans, ants, and termites are unique in this particular way of division of labor and coordination of individuals. And we all have similar energy and size relationships. So we kind of pontificates as well as others. Did we humans choose to perform agriculture, or did agriculture sort of choose us in some sense, and we evolved to be a part of it? So so what does it mean to express this? This is just food for thought here. There's some scientific understanding of things, how the world works, and is there some growth of dissipative systems, some sort of general growth driver for growth out there that we're trying to understand how much it does or does not exist. I brought up these ideas in the box here as some very small subset of scientific understanding, evolution, natural selection, Jevons paradox, thinking about translating to the economy, the concept of the maximum power principle. And of course, we observe these energy and size scaling laws between energy consumption and size. So, what is the basis of decision-making in the economy for any level, consumers or companies or governments? And how would you know, or how would we think about whether doing something is an example of human agency, which would say, be there to potentially counteract the concept on the far left of the screen, some sort of inherent potential derived for growth. So if you use markets as a basis of decision-making, it's common that you can include, quote unquote, all externalities, whatever it is, you could sort of make another market for it, right? So is that an expression of human agency? Just keep making markets and markets and markets to include every single thing. We know we can include, say, like a carbon market conceptually over the entire economy, yet we have globally chosen not to do that yet, or at least has not been enacted by the political leaders, if you will. What else would you use? Some sort of values, something that's not based on quantifying prices, something that's based on some other idea. People will, of course, disagree on values. And if you were expressing agency, what would this be? You would potentially restrict investment options. Just say, well, you could build machine X, but we're just not going to allow you to build that machine. This machine is not worthy for one reason or another. So I'm not going to allow you to do that. And there could be many other things here. So I'm not trying to make a comprehensive list. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I have a quick question to kick us off. And then everybody just pile in, free for all. That graph you had about GDP and energy consumption and with the ant colonies and all this kind of stuff, and the sublinear relationship between mass and energy and all this kind of stuff. What I would be curious to know is, would it be possible to understand this through wealth inequality and track, capitalists and billionaires as being of like an almost different colony compared to the vast majority of the rest of people, and therefore look at their access to wealth or the amount of wealth that they have, perhaps the GDP that they produce, and then their energy consumption. Because whilst it was very interesting to see that there has been a sort of slight decoupling with energy consumption versus 2/3 of GDP, also from what I understand, the energy consumption of the 0.1% of the billionaire class is also going through the roof. So would there be a way to track that on some level using this same equation?
Right. I think people have tracked it. I haven't put it. I think there are two different contexts that you're bringing up. And the question is, how are they related? How's the individuals, including me, I think I'd roughly be, I don't know, in the top 10% of the world. And yeah, something like top 10% of the world consumes 50% of the energy or has 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions, this kind of thing. So I didn't show ideas from, I guess, what people call econo physics and tracking the distribution of incomes or consumption in the world. But it is, as you say, so to me, I don't have the answer, but the sort of question in my head is, it seems like there sort of will be an inherent, well, this is the question, is if you inherently enable or allow or don't correct via taxes or something like this, an unequal distribution of, say, wealth in general or income, how much is that a requirement for growth? I don't know. So the information I showed is sort of saying it seems to be, once you get to a coordination of individuals, that could be cells or ants or humans, that to coordinate them, you are going to start to restrict some of them from consuming as much energy as the others. And so for an animal, it's maybe roughly easy to think about, as I grow all my organs. When we're born, our organs are roughly, let's just say, all fully formed, but they grow in different portions. So as we grow mostly bone and muscle. Bone and muscle are low energy, dense types of organs relative to our brain and our heart, say. The brain and the heart still grow, but they don't grow as fast. And, others on here may explain, why that is. You can imagine, well, it's to require locomotion, to go get food and go do things. And you don't need much more brain to go walk around. You need some legs and some arms or 4 legs or whatever you need to go walk around and get food. So each new cell that's added to the animal or body is by definition a cell that consumes less energy per mass. And so, but that means that the overall animal ends up having less energy consumption per mass as it grows. And that this enables it to do more work, you would say, physical work, walk around and get food. So how much does each individual cell in the body translate to each individual person in the world and like their income? I think that's a good question.
Thank you.
Well, I had one question that the Jevons discussion brought up. I've been thinking about that for many years, and I think it may be a indication of a learning phase difference between the general public, who realize that the system as a whole needs to become more efficient to survive on Earth, and businesses that see efficiency as a way to increase production and multiply impacts and shorten our time on Earth, and that they don't talk to each other or understand each other's motives or processes. That here we have an example of grand scale societal miscommunication, perhaps. What do you think of that, Carey?
I haven't thought too deeply, but I've thought roughly about what's the difference between, say, efficiency in industry or production, as you're discussing, and efficiency is like me as a consumer who buys a car that's not obviously, or does something to my home to make it more efficient, like insulation. That's not obviously part of the production system. And that's a philosophical discussion, whether you can make such a distinction. But one way to start thinking about it, and this maybe it's not really too much of a United States centric perspective. After World War II until the 1970s, the Texas Railroad Commission, essentially the arbiter of dictating oil prices, because we had the spare capacity for oil production, and the Texas Railroad Commission was restricting oil output from Texas, which effectively restricted oil output to the world, and to keep the price stable. So if they allowed all the oil producers to produce as much as they want, they would have produced too much, the price would have tanked, and the industry would have kind of been put into a big slump. So they were prorating this, which is one way to say the energy extraction, the ability to extract energy from the environment was so high, there wasn't enough machines to consume the energy. And so in the United States, each additional home that was built during this time consumed more energy than the previous home. Each additional car consumed more energy per year, say, than the previous car. So that held up until the 1970s. And then the early 1970s, this couldn't work anymore because every single oil well in Texas was producing as much as it could. And so now the restriction was no longer, do you have enough machines to consume energy? The question was now, do you have enough machines to extract energy from the environment? And now the investment in energy extraction stuff, if you will, and energy consumption equipment, if you will, had to be in some sense more coordinated. I don't know if that's the right word, in tandem. And then you see after that time that each home in the US on average consumed less energy since the 1970s than the previous home. Each car consumed less energy than the previous car. And we can interpret this as efficiency, or we can interpret it more generically, I think, as it was going to have to consume less energy one way or the other, whether it was more efficient or not. And you would have a choice to say, well, my home's going to consume less energy because the superorganism is now more constrained. I can choose to make my home more efficient and still have nice services and a nice home to live in, or I can not make that investment and I just have a less controlled environment in my home, or it's hotter in my home, or colder in the winter, or hotter in the summer. So that's, I don't know. Yeah, hopefully that makes some sense. But the patterns definitely seem to change in the 1970s for this energy extraction capability versus energy consumption capability. It sort of switched around that time.
Well, I have one question. So thanks for this presentation, Carey. I think it's very illuminating. However, I even though I also like to plot these correlations between GDP and energy, etc., I sometimes wonder if that is not overly simplistic, because I think many of us use GDP as a proxy for the demands of society just because the numbers are available. But there are some other measures. The question is, what are you optimizing for? And is GDP actually the correct quantity to optimize for? If you look at, there are lots of other human progress, what is it called? The social progress index and the human development index, etc. And if you look at them, you will actually see that these per capita have actually been decreasing now for the last couple of years. So I just want to start the discussion here. What are we really optimizing for, and what is GDP actually measuring?
Right. I can speak for myself, at least in terms of showing this type of information. I'm not trying to imply I or the economy is optimizing for anything in particular, like GDP or something like that. Steve Keen might talk about, of course, work of Bob Ayers, but the GDP seems to be a proxy for useful work or work done by the economy, like physical work done. So this is kind of the area of research that myself and others are kind of pursuing to try to prove out or disprove. But the other thing is the economic modeling that I'm working on from a integrating macroeconomics, post-Keynesian ideas with physical flows of mass and energy is there to try to address your question a little bit. And that concept of what I'm doing, I'm trying to track capital as mass itself, not as a monetary unit, but I can add a monetary value to it so that I can plot a little bit more of a one-to-one correspondence. And in my last paper, I do this, or at least pontificate. My model shows the same tendencies as the biological trends I showed here. So I can track capital as a physical mass, not as some valuation of GDP, and plot the same type of relationship. So to be clear, yeah, I'm plotting energy consumption and mass of biological organisms with energy consumption and GDP, which is not mass, which is another flow. This is maybe partly what you're bringing up. So yeah, I am interested in making the analog more explicit, but so far nothing has told me that it's at least not a appropriate proxy at this time. But the tracking of GDP with useful work, which is energy times efficiency of the economy to work, seems to be a near one-to-one relationship for what's been studied so far. And I think that's one of the great insights of that area of the research.
All right, thank you very much, Carey. Henrik, if we just crack on directly with your presentation.
So yeah, just short introduction. Thanks, by the way, Rachel, for setting this up. So my name is Henrik Nordborg. I'm a physicist actually by training. I have to plead my defense already at the outset here, because even though I am I am a physicist, this presentation or the idea that I'm going to present here has in a way very little to do with science. So it's basically, it's based perhaps partly on the fact that I spent 10 years working in the private sector. And it's interesting when we work in the private sector and you encounter a problem, the first question the managers ask you, is there any way we can solve this problem without new science? Because science takes time and it costs a lot of money. And if you already have a solution, we should perhaps do it. And I think actually with climate change, if you want to be a bit provocative, there's not much science involved because it's fairly obvious what is going on. And the other thing is that I started giving public climate lectures some 8 years ago. And towards the end, I realized that I have to give people hope by proposing some sort of solution. And since I couldn't find any solution anywhere in the literature, I decided to sort of come up with one myself. So that is basically the basis for this presentation. And the first point I want to make, and I think it's, just state the obvious facts. The obvious fact is this is the Keeling curve. This is, you probably all know it, the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere starting at 280 ppm before the Industrial Revolution. Now we are at 420 ppm, meaning that every third CO2 molecule in the atmosphere is actually anthropogenic, has been put there by us. And what we should probably try to avoid is the red area up here. If we want to stay significantly below 2 degrees of warming. And as we see, there have been lots of attempts to do something like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, etc., the Climate Strikes Back Greta, and this hasn't had any impact whatsoever on this curve. And of course, the shocking thing is not only that we are up here, even though that would be shocking enough, it's actually higher than any time during the last 3 million years or so. But the fact that the carbon concentration in the atmosphere is actually rising faster than ever before. I mean, basically 3 times faster than in the 60s. So with that information, I think it's fair to say that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has failed. I mean, and I know this is very unpopular. I don't want to criticize anyone in particular, but if you read this document, the ultimate objective was stabilization of the greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would not interfere with climate, basically. And if you then consider that 30 years later, these concentrations are rising faster than ever, that is a failure. I mean, there's no need to mince words here. So what that means is, of course, that there is currently no plan in the world to stop climate destruction. And by the way, I have started to advocate the use of climate destruction instead of climate change, because climate destruction, the definition is it's anthropogenic climate change with disastrous repercussions. And the reason why I like it better is because it's clear who is driving the destruction. I mean, it's an active process. We are destroying the climate, and it could be stopped if we stopped doing so, and also that the repercussions or the consequences will be pretty fatal. So anyway, if we realize this, then of course there are basically 2 questions to my mind. Question number 1 is, of course, we need to ask ourselves, why did we fail? And then the second question is, and the only reason why we have to ask the first question is, of course, what do we do now? Because we're really, really running out of time here. If we continue like this, we will hit this 450 ppm in 10 years or so, and we don't want to do that. So to my mind, it's fairly obvious why we failed. This is my crowd pleaser. I made this diagram some while ago, and it's when giving presentations, and it's global carbon emissions on one axis and global GDP on the other axis. And since the 70s, if you scale the axis and appropriately, they basically lie on the top of each other. And now, of course, the G20 nations believe that we should continue to have at least 2 degrees of continued growth. And on the other hand, the Paris Agreement calls for having carbon emissions in 10 years, which corresponds to about, 6.7 or so % of annual decrease in carbon emissions. And obviously, the reason why I call this a crowd pleaser is when I show this in public lectures, the whole audience starts laughing, and it's a very good point, because then you can basically tell them this is no laughing matter. This is the official policy for dealing with climate change today, and it's obviously ridiculous. So why did we? So the problem is, this was basically hoping for a miracle, and of course, this miracle unfortunately did not occur. So the problem is, of course, that we are still in the fossil fuel age. The whole question, we framed the question wrong. We should never have talked about replacing fossil fuels, because I think it was very obvious from the outset that fossil fuels cannot be replaced. There are no other materials on this planet that are that versatile and good to use. So we need to rethink and rebuild our entire society in order to solve this problem. The problem is, however, that countries and corporations and people, individuals compete, and we compete technologically, mostly peacefully, technologically and economically. But as we see in Ukraine now and other places, the ultimate ratio of foreign policy is war, and sometimes we compete with military means. And no country is basically prepared to let one's guard down to protect the environment. It's kind of like asking the Roman army to, if the Romans were to find out that steel production is too bad for the environment, so they switch back to stone axes. That is not going to happen. The country with the most advanced technology and the most fossil fuels typically wins wars. So that is a conflict we have. We also see that international agreements, voluntary international agreements, don't really work unless there is an enforcement mechanism. I think there's ample. Most countries now more or less have to admit that they didn't live up to their commitments, given at the Paris Agreement, and there are no consequences for that. So anyway, this of course led to the myth of sustainable growth, and I think it was it's very understandable. Sustainable growth was introduced basically. It was like pretending that decarbonization would be easy, because people realized that if it were not, if actually it would be very costly to get out of fossil fuels, there's no way nations will voluntarily agree to do so. And basically, so the Paris Agreement, if you want to be a bit cynical about it, it's not really a decision to stop climate change. It's a decision to stop climate change, provided that it doesn't really cost anything or threaten existing power structures. Whether this was a wishful thinking, I think it was wishful thinking from the outset, given that Limits to Growth had actually been published already 20 years earlier. But that's not the point. I think we can all agree that this decoupling, the sustainable growth, which would have required decoupling of the economy from carbon emissions, actually, it didn't happen. So now, of course, there are two ways out of this, as I see it. One idea is, of course, to say, let's switch to society where people do not compete. And even though I can sympathize with this idea, I don't think that's realistic. And the other thing is, of course, and at the risk of being a bit trivial here, sports, a soccer match is also competitive, but we have some rules that prevent people from killing each other. So the question is, I mean, we obviously have a completely bonkers economic system. We have an economic system that rewards material extraction and environmental destruction. And it actually punishes countries that implement ambitious climate policies. So we have to change the rules. We need a system that makes it possible to actually benefit from not doing anything, because not doing anything is the best thing we can do to protect the environment. But of course, we don't want to prevent people from having good ideas. I mean, in the renewable energy sector, there have been some good ideas. It should actually be profitable for a nation to degrow, and greenwashing should be impossible. And I think it can be done, and this is kind of the idea that I want to present here. And it's very simple, and that I think is the main benefit. So the point is, we know that all the carbon that is released into the atmosphere eventually comes from a small number of fossil fuel producers, a couple of hundred companies, and they know exactly how much carbon emissions they produce. If you burn a barrel of oil, you know exactly how much carbon dioxide will be produced. So it's very easy to measure production. There will be no administrative effort involved. So we basically demand all fossil fuel users worldwide pay a fee directly proportional to their production to Global Fund. The point is, it's not penalizing fossil fuel producers directly. They would only act as tax collectors, because they would be free to pass on these costs to their customers. And then you take this money from the fund and distribute that among the world's population or the world's nation on a per capita basis, which respects national sovereignty. We don't need a world government for that. Again, there's absolutely no administrative effort involved, and all governments receive money, which they typically like, without any tax increase. And then, of course, we increase this fee until the carbon emissions start decreasing. I just recently saw this. There's a Netflix series, Borgen, about, and the latest season is about, it's about Danish policy or politics in Denmark. And the plot is that they find lots of oil in Greenland. And of course, we all know what would happen. They would, of course, say that, well, we have signed the Paris Agreement, but after all, if we exploit this and pump this oil, we will get very rich. So eventually, we all know that if a country finds a lot of oil, it will probably use it with the current system. If you put in the climate compensation, I mean, they would still be free to pump the oil, but they would have to share the revenue that they get from this oil with the rest of the world. And then actually a government might actually decide, if the production costs are too high, that this is not worth the effort. Just leave it. And of course, there's a good scientific argument for sharing these profits, because this is most people don't think about it. The reason why fossil fuels are so extremely useful is, of course, that most of the fuel is taken from the atmosphere. If you take the chemical reaction, 1 ton of coal, and you burn it, it reacts with oxygen. You use 2.7 tons of oxygen and produce 3.7 tons of carbon dioxide. So the main mass, or the same thing if you drive a car powered by gas, the main energy that you use to actually power your vehicle is not taken from the tank of gas, but from the atmosphere. And that means that every barrel of oil that you sell in the world is, of course, sold with a license to destroy the atmosphere. And I mean, my idea is basically to say, well, we know exactly how much atmosphere we need for this, so why don't you pay for it? And that is what this plan would sort of implement. The redistribution is necessary, and one of the people who point this out is Jason Hickel. He's very adamant about this because, after all, we have these enormous inequalities in the world. The entire global north has much too high carbon footprint. So if we introduce a revenue neutral or cost neutral carbon tax within the rich world, that is not going to change anything. It will redistribute some money within nations that already consume too much anyway. And there's no way that's going to help. We really have a way. We need to force rich nations to pay for their wasteful lifestyle. And then the other point is, of course, that if you implement such a plan, I mean, this would be a global carbon tax. It will be the same in every country. That will lead to inflation, higher prices, and that means that we, of course, have to make sure that poorer countries can survive. But I think that there's a very good argument for that. I think that would basically eradicate global poverty. It's actually interesting if you look at it. If you implement $100 per ton of carbon dioxide, that will give a universal basic income of $450 per capita and year for every person in the world. So with this, I'm almost done. This idea might sound a bit simplistic, but I mean, don't worry. I'm completely aware of the fact that we are probably at the most dangerous point in human history, and I'm sometimes worried that we're discussing water prices when our house is on fire. I mean, the world is. We have many problems. We have climate destruction. We have loss of biodiversity. We have food insecurity, chemical pollution, antibiotics resistance, freshwater access, resource wars, nuclear proliferation. And recently we have a lot of mad kings, complete idiots that are governing the world. And I mean, this is a real problem. However, we have to start somewhere. And my idea is a bit that perfect is the enemy of good here. We know that climate destruction is probably the most wicked of these problems because it's a completely global problem. Greenhouse gases know absolutely no boundaries. And this means that it's a perfect tragedy of a commons or prisoner's dilemma, especially for smaller countries. Even if a country like Switzerland cuts down on its carbon emission, it won't stop climate change. It will only cause costs. It will be costly for a small country, and it will have no impact on climate change, basically. So we need some sort of global solution. And the other point is, I think that cheap fossil fuels are really the driving force behind much of environmental destruction. And another problem we have, and this has been now pointed out, there was a paper recently or an article by David Wallace Wells, and even Ernst & Young in Australia were talking about this, that the problem we have today is that everyone is lying. Every company, every politician, of course, admit that climate change is a problem today. This has changed in the last 10 or 20 years. But if you compare their commitments to what they're actually doing, there's an enormous discrepancy. So it means that even if you tell politicians or make politicians promise that they are going to solve the problem, that is not going to help us at this point. Another thing is we need some sort of collaboration, international collaboration between countries. And in order to do this, I think we need to come up with one simple new rule that sort of can also be used to build re-establish trust between nations. So in a way, if you want to make a kind of warlike comparison here, global climate compensation, it's kind of like the ceasefire agreement that we use to end the war. We first have to agree on something, and we have to make sure that everyone sticks to this agreement, because that would build perhaps some level of trust between nations. It would basically invalidate any business model that is based on fossil fuels. And what I like about this idea is I think it's substantial. If we could introduce a significant global carbon tax, that would be substantial. It's something that's enforceable because it's only a small number of fossil fuel companies that have to participate. We're not talking about changing the behavior of billions of people here. It's like these couple of hundred companies that need to do something, which they are perfectly able to do. And it's testable. So we don't have to trust our politicians or business leaders that they're actually doing something. It's easy. We can directly check are the fossil fuel companies paying, or are they not? And any business that claims to have a plan for carbon neutrality, any nation that has a plausible plan for climate neutrality should actually be in favor of this, because if once you have decarbonized your supply chain, your production costs would not increase when this system goes into effect. Okay, so that was all from my side. I guess it's more sort of it's more like what to do rather than why to do it, because I think you know that at least as good as I do, but it is an attempt to get something done. Okay, thanks a lot.
Well, I'll go. Let's see. So I'm half engineer, but the other half of me is a social scientist. So listening to both you and Carey, it's very clear to me that we haven't really figured out how to integrate the reality of the human level of complexity with the technical issues that we're talking about. So let's see. In terms of, it's not really very helpful to think of politicians and business people as lying. Rather, they're really doing exactly what their society or the dominant economic system has told them to do, which is to maximize profit for a few people on top, right? I mean, so it's not just that it's capitalistic and self-serving, it's that it's only self-serving for the people on the very top. And we've set up all of these, a matrix of rewards and punishments and norms and beliefs and values that all push people to do the same kind of thing. So that's why if you have all of this wonderful data that tells you why you need debt, not exhaust all of your fuels and not pollute the planet and not do all this destructive kind of thing, what you're going to get is greenwashing, because that's the most efficient way for them to maximize profit without actually having to, well, it's just the best way to maximize profit. So what you've done is you've put all of the intelligence and creative capacities of people who have been specifically selected for their ability to maximize profit for elites. Mm-hmm. They're just going to find ever more creative ways of working up their way out of it, unless you attack the root problem, which is profit maximizing laws themselves.
I totally agree. And this is why I really believe that what you need is you need to change the rules. And that is basically what I'm trying to accomplish here. Because if you have such an automatic redistribution scheme, it would actually, any business model that is heavily reliant on fossil fuels will suddenly not be profitable anymore. And I think that is that gets you out of this argument, because the profit maximizers would then say, let's optimize our business under the new set of rules. And that might actually be a different, they would come up with a different optimal solution in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. But on the other hand, don't you think mostly they're going to figure out a way around it? Either they'll pay off politicians to stop things. I mean, I'm living in the US right now, so I have people who are,
No, I totally agree in the sense that, yeah, I mean, implementing this will be extremely difficult, but that is kind of course, the thing that if you, that is, of course, why politicians then prefer to implement things that do not have an impact, which to me is like the kind of definition of greenwashing. I mean, exactly. There's this enormous gap between what climate science tells us would be actually required to do, and what politicians and business leaders say would be possible to do from a business or political perspective. And bridging this gap, I think, is kind of the name of a game here. That's kind of what I'm going for. Now, the other thing is, if you could target a very small group of organizations. I mean, we know where the carbon comes from. I think that's a very important point to make. An airline doesn't produce any carbon, and it buys all the carbon it then emits into the atmosphere. The same is true for like someone who drives a car. So I mean, getting it at the source would actually be a good thing, and it would solve another problem. I don't know if anyone saw this article recently. Apparently, Saudi Arabia is currently importing a lot of oil from Russia. Well, of course they do.
Yeah.
Because they buy cheap oil from Russia and then they sell it at Saudi oil, and there is no sanctions on Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, the oil gets out on the market.
Right.
So, I mean, is anyone surprised? No.
No.
And so this is why you have to sort of get it at the source, I think.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. So the two talks really got me thinking about if there's any parallel between these large systems and, say, much simpler physical systems. So obviously it takes a lot of activation energy to do anything. So in the physical system, say you have supercooled water, you still have to make a nucleus, and the nucleation process takes some activation energy. So in this case, do you guys see any potential for creating such a nucleus for transition to, say, the scheme that Henrik is talking about? And are there like precedent that you know that in some measures that measures what's the cost to society locally? So I don't know, like people congregating, resource being pulled, diverting, momentarily from other pursuits that's in line with what the system is trying to do in maximizing profit, and what's that local disturbance and the level that's needed to create such a nucleus? Are there such studies?
Do you want to go first, Carey?
Oh, I think I don't have. Well, I have one thing to say, which is not the answer. Something I heard from Tom Murphy, physicist at UC San Diego, and sort of do the math blog. Maybe guy related. He was just said something like the Briggs-Myers test, that some measure of personality. One part of it is, are you an abstract thinker? I can't remember what the term is in the Briggs-Myers context, but one of it is, are you an abstract thinker, or are you somebody who needs more hands-on and experiential learning? And he seemed to imply that there was a survey done on Americans that 27% were abstract thinkers and 73% were more hands-on thinkers. So our discussion here is kind of this abstract, and that made me think, are you asking the question, or you need a critical mass of abstract thinkers to be able to translate these ideas? And if you're sort of by definition, roughly 25% of the total, how is that fundamentally a problem that can't be overcome? I don't know. So I'm just throwing that out there as my only thought. So I'll stop there.
Okay, so I have one thought, and that is actually from a German sociologist, Harald Welzer, who was talking about the anti-nuclear movement in Germany. And what he said was a very critical ingredient is that you have to have if you want to have effective activism, if you really want to get something done, you have to have a well-defined enemy and a well-defined set of demands. And the nuclear industry in Germany, there were many people who were against it. There were people who were against these big projects. There were people who were concerned with the risks, with the anti-proliferation movement. There were lots of people who did not like the nuclear industry. And since it was such a small group of companies and there were so many people who hated them, it was kind of difficult. They lost the battle. And that is also kind of my thinking here. If you say that there are like a small number of couple of hundred CEOs in the world that are responsible for taking carbon out of the ground, and there are billions of people who hate them, it might be possible to sort of make them see the light, especially since the demand we are making is a very reasonable one. We're not demanding them to lie down and die. We're basically saying, like, act as tax collectors. and you get off. I mean, it's like, so I think it's the combination of enormous social, political, legal pressure on a small group of people combined with a very specific and reasonable demand, I think, is to me the solution.
I'd actually like to jump in as well and say, surely there's been precedent with World War I and World War II, how communities and nations came together to redirect the physical systems and the economy in order to end the war. It's exactly as Henrik's saying, when there is a common enemy, we seem more able to act as a collective. And that is one of the problems when sort of facing this neoliberal, like crazy capitalist society, the atomization of individuals. And the representation of the problem of climate change as an individual problem is really sort of impeding any collective action.
I didn't introduce myself before. I'm a physicist who had to switch to studying design and organization because physics doesn't address the little nonlinear transients that begin and end all systems, and that's what I was interested in. So, that's where my life path came from, and there's so many good things you brought up, Henrik, but there are a couple. One, you said you showed the atmospheric CO2 curve, which is if you analyze it mathematically, it's a pure 2% per year growth rate. Of course, that requires finding the baseline, which I have a way to do. But if you look at the emissions curves, they don't match. So I think there's something wrong with our emissions, or else there are other sources we're not counting. So I think that's an additional factor to look into. But the clear thing from the math of the atmospheric curve is that climate change has been accelerating at high compound rates for a long time. It still is. And then the other thing is, you say the FCC, I forget all the initials, FCCC. Anyway,
FCCC,
yeah, well, the IPCC's organization fails to recognize Jevons, that it treats in its mind that efficiency is reducing the system impact when it's multiplying the system impact, and this is a very persistent example of the fixations that human minds develop when they're following rules. They get stuck on the rule and they don't see the context. And so at present we have a world community that's split between people who are emotionally connected with the context, who feel all the impacts multiplying, and a world community that doesn't. So don't we need to do something about that? And as far as I can tell, that it involves coming to the we have to change, or else recognition by the leaders of the economy, recognizing that what they're doing is a threat to themselves as well as everyone else. Would you
Can I make a quick comment there?
Sure.
Yep, I totally agree. And I think that the problem at the moment is really, first, until the last IPCC report, they didn't even consider regrowth. I mean, it was all sustainable growth. It was the economy is growing. All the scenarios, emission scenarios were based on this. The other point is, I am very worried that very many people in the global north, I don't want to mention any names, but I know very decent people, intelligent and decent people, who basically say, well, it is over. We have to basically just shut down the borders, and in the north, we will be able to survive because we are rich enough and we are sort of living in the part of the world that might have one chance of surviving. I mean, I'm sitting in Sweden now. I mean, I'm in that sense, climate-wise, we don't even have a heat wave here. So I feel fairly comfortable at the moment. But I mean, I'm worried that very many people are actually thinking like that already.
Yeah. Well, I look at it demographically, that it really concentrates in the highly educated, well-mannered, successful professionals who manage all the world systems, that they have a split personality, one at work and one at home. At home, they're very good, well-mannered, engaged individuals caring about their local contexts and relationships and communities. And when they get to following their business rules, they ignore the context entirely. So I think that there's a, it's like a boil to be lanced.
Yeah. Hannah Arendt wrote a book about that, didn't she? The Banality of Evil.
Well, but this is evil by nice people. So you have to do it by caring instead of by attacking.
Yeah.
Attacking will only harden the positions. Anyway, all that stuff.
Right. I'm afraid we must move on to Yi's presentation. Sorry, Carey and Sally. If you note your questions perhaps in the chat, maybe Henrik or somebody else can respond to them.
All right. First of all, thanks for organizing this event. I think I'm partly responsible for it, and I reached out to ask for basically advice from Rachel to see whether people, that she has interviewed can help me really understand better what realistically are humans able to devote to solving this crisis. So both in terms of material flux and also in terms of energy flux. And in thinking about it, we sort of came to develop a parameter that we're calling a cooling return on investment. That's in analogy to the energy return on investment. We are talking about energy extraction. And I think this parameter is a multidisciplinary one that has to invoke understanding of climate science and the current heating power that's driving global warming. So I added a few slides because Rachel wanted some introduction. So I was trained as a chemist, physicist, and a fabrication person making nanoscale stuff and devices and ultra-sensitive sensing in high vacuum. And between 2016 and 2021, I was employed by the Rowland Institute at Harvard as a principal investigator. So the goal was to build an atomic resolution microscope that could deliver a structure of any heterogeneous particles of matter in 3D, utilizing the principles of atomic force microscopy and also MRI imaging. And we won't go into details, but some examples of our work towards that grandiose analytical goal include the fabrication of these ladder-shaped tiny objects. The thickness of these different rungs of the ladder are just a few hundreds to thousand atoms wide. So it's a tour de force to learn to make these structures, carving them out of a single crystal piece of silicon. And we also learned to do machining that's really high resolution, at least in the depth dimension, by completely reconfiguring an ancient electron microscope. So these are like pretty fun project that's occupied most of my time before I really became aware of the severity of the climate crisis between 2017 and by 2019, it became like undeniable that society and also human system, Earth system is in deep trouble. And since then, we have been devoting our attention to looking at how concepts and thinking from engineering and nanoscience could help address the urgent problem. So today I will perhaps focus on two points of this graph that I usually show at the beginning of some of my presentations. One is that actually, even if somehow we were able to completely shut down the emission of CO2, it's still pretty improbable that we could stabilize global temperatures to within 2-degree targets. The other is actually there seems to be a very missing central metric that people haven't really been thinking about when they're just proposing different solutions to climate change, and sort of realizing that we have to have this very central metric that perhaps can help us assess and thinking in ways that are more efficient. And hopefully I will talk a little bit about our preliminary results. And actually today, I think it's more interesting to start on the small scale, because we think, anything, big projects start in a garage. So let's see what we're talking about using MEERs to rebalance Earth energy can do at very small scale. So the experiments I'm describing started summer of 2021, and we really started using a micro experiment. On land, we had the 2 MEERs, and the data were collected since July of 2021. And we placed sensors at different depth in the soil and around this tiny microarray. We also set up a floating MEER experiment assessing the impact on evaporation and water temperature also last year. And the experiments were in collaboration with both people at the Rowland Institute and also different universities in New Hampshire for the land-based experiment. For the land experiments, we observed quite substantial cooling of the soil temperature and the variation. You can see these daily diurnal cycles where the temperature difference between control and the mirrored field maximizes around middle of the day. We can visualize the same data by looking at the difference to make the difference more visible, and we call that anomaly. So for the case of MEER on the ground, we can observe up to 5 degrees Celsius reduction in the temperature of the soil at a depth of 10 centimeters. And if we model the depth dependence of cooling as the usual exponential function, at surface cooling is up to about 10 degrees Celsius for a rather sunny day in New Hampshire. So it's not the place that receives the most sunlight. So it gives us some confidence that these MEER arrays could have significant impact on local temperature, at least. And very similar results were observed for the aquatic system. And you can notice that if we look at these time series, the water system is much more sinusoidal, and that's a simple reflection of the fact that water has a much higher thermal mass. Whereas in the case of land, the temperature response pretty much follows or more closely follows the solar irradiance variation throughout the day. And that message can also be captured when we look at the response of the passive cooling amplitude as a function of solar irradiance at different frequency bands. So at the 1 day inverse frequency, which is in this case high frequency, we have about 3 to 4 degrees cooling at 800 watt per meter squared of solar radiation. And approximately the same slope was observed when we look at multi-day response. And the difference is a bit more drastic for the case of the water, reflecting again the heat capacity of the system. So what can this soil cooling do? Like in addition to perhaps preserving crop yield during heat wave events, it's also possible that cooling of the soil might, on longer term, stabilize soil carbon. So these data are collected from different locations of the world, looking at the relationship between annual mean temperature and the soil carbon content. And I'd like to draw your attention to this really high temperature end. It seems like the slope really becomes steeper on this linear log plot. So if we can really prevent the occurrence of really highly extremely hot weathers from really cooking the soil, it might be a useful way to help reducing emissions from soil, and perhaps hopefully actually improve the sink capacity and the storage capacity of our agricultural land. And another potential application of floating array could be to help bleaching coral reefs avoid some of the worst thermal exposures. And some of those is measured by degree heating weeks. So it's a product of the dose, basically how many degrees it's above average times the duration of the exposure. And in our very modest small bin experiment, we could measure a dose reduction comparable to what would be necessary to prevent a lot of the bleaching for coral ecosystems. So this year, we're expanding the experiment to look at the impact of array density on different soil temperature, moisture, and air temperature, moisture responses. And this experiments are, again, done in collaboration with collaborators in New Hampshire. So a question that we often get from the audience is whether these surface-based mirror arrays could interfere with aviation. So actually, it's not really an issue because our test site has been approved and is right next to the municipal airport of Plymouth, New Hampshire. And over here is just a sketch of a particular array and sensor placement as a way to measure heterogeneity, both in and around a microenvironment around the device, and also as a function of edge distance from the edge. So this picture on the left is really nice, I think, because it also illustrates the fact that the specular reflection is has a lot of potential for urban cooling applications. So right now there's a lot of call to paint roads and the roofs white in order to reduce heating over during heat wave season, and also as a result of the urban heat island effect. And what the latest data on human physiology is showing is that when you have white pavement, it's really uncomfortable for the pedestrian, because when you're outside, it's like you're standing in snow. Only difference being that the sun is a lot straight overhead, so you have a lot more solar irradiance being scattered and reflected by the ground, and there's no way to hide as a pedestrian. So individual pedestrian comfort actually significantly decreases when you paint pavements white. In the case of specular reflectors on the ground, for example, it's much easier, or at least potentially possible, to engineer shading strategies such that you don't really get direct exposure from sunlight in the reflected part. All right, so now let's spend a few minutes discussing why the aspirational 2-degree target is not really possible, even if we were to stop all emissions back, even right now or a few years back. When fossil fuel is burnt, there are different components that are emitted. There are the atmospheric warming components, CO2 being the major one, but there are also short-lived particles that's driven by atmospheric chemistry with a starting material that includes NOx emissions, unburnt organic components, and also ozone. So the main difference is that the warming components are several orders of magnitude longer lived than these cooling components. And the heating power that has traditionally, or in the past, driven global warming is the difference between the warming and the cooling components. And in a hypothetical scenario where we were to stop current emissions, the short-lived components would really fall out of the sky within a few days. And the consequence would be a very rapid increase of the net forcing or net warming impact, greenhouse gas emissions. One slight positive from the COVID lockdowns in 2020 was that it actually provided fortuitous experiment to be done by the climate science simulation community, looking at a transient perturbation of this net forcing by a small amount, roughly maybe by a third during like a few weeks to months at different locations. So the expectation is that when you have more light coming down as a result of the pollution clearing up, you will have more heat converted at surface. And a hotter surface will increase both the evaporation of water, both from lakes, reservoirs, and plants, but also you will also have air rising and driving more vigorous lateral circulation of the atmosphere. And that can then in turn transport this water vapor over longer distances. And when they come down, you might have more and more extensive rain compared to historical records. So observation, at least for the amount of solar radiation coming down, has been confirmed. So there's generally at least a 2 watt per meter squared of extra heating power from the sun on the ground, measured in different parts of the world. In Europe, where air quality is already pretty good to start with, this increase is rather modest. In other parts of the world, like India, the increase has been observed to be up to about 10 watt per meter squared, sometimes 20 watt per meter squared. So the increased solar radiation has led to increased land heating. So the most studied place is in China, where land surface temperature anomaly of about half a degree Celsius was observed as a result of a 2-month lockdown. And this warming has been found to contribute to at least 1/3 of this extreme anomaly observed in 2020. So it's now quite widely accepted by various groups looking at the events of 2020, that extreme monsoon and rainfall of that year can at least partially be explained by the reduction of fossil fuel emissions and reduction of anthropogenic particles that scatter light. And we all know that this year we're again setting records, also perhaps in precipitation in China, and they also had quite another lockdown that's quite strict earlier a few months back. So, but studies are yet to come out to analyzing to tease out any causal relationship between more recent events. So the recent observations basically confirm what we have known for a long time, that these pollution are hiding a significant power density from reaching Earth's surface. And if we were to really translate this hidden power to a temperature difference on Earth's surface, we need to multiply this power density by the conversion factor, which can be derived from paleo climate data. And it's pretty conveniently 1, roughly. So you multiply these two numbers together, it's roughly another degree Celsius of heating that's baked in. And there's an extensive list of literature to establish these very basic expectations. And it's also really acknowledged in the more technical portions of the IPCC, but the magnitude has been really downplayed to the lowest bottom limit in the summary for policymakers. So as a result, of the trouble we're in as far as climate is concerned, there's so many solutions that are being proposed. But oftentimes when you look at the proposals, many people fail to really subject them into very simple sanity checks. And what do I mean by sanity checks? For the problem of addressing climate, first of all, it has to work at small scale. We have to be able to scale the full thing while respecting material and energy constraints of the human civilization. And we also have to be able to do it fast enough within the years, maybe perhaps decades, that we have left. So what do we actually mean by work at small scale? Well, this is perhaps one of the most important slides in this presentation. So the problem that we're dealing with is the fact that there is a gigantic excess power coming in on the Earth system, because we have reduced the rate at which heat can leave the system. So the difference of how quickly sunlight is being converted into heat versus how quickly that heat can escape through IR radiation. Now, if we also include the aerosol component that's hidden, it's roughly 1,000 terawatts. And we just heard also from previous talk that humanity consume only about on the order of 20 terawatts. So that's a gigantic difference in orders of magnitude. So we need to pause for a second and really think what that means. It basically means that if we were to deal with this problem using any engineering method, we need to have enormous system efficiency. So if somehow we were able to, use all of our primary energy consumption to deal with the problem, we still need to have a cooling return on the investment of 100. But obviously, I think it's not possible for humans to really give up eating or housing or doing other things just to fix the climate and also to survive past a few days or years. So let's say somehow we were able to muster 10% of the energy and devote to this task, then we still need a CROI of 1,000. Okay. So a very important criterion, I guess, is that any proposal needs to at least achieve a CROI, at least on paper, of greater than 1,000 before it's even, useful to talk about it. But of course, it could be actually 10,000 that's needed if we could only leverage 1% of the energy and the material resources to combat the problem. So I think it's a question for the audience here, and I'm really seeking your expertise and your expert input on what that percentage actually is. Here is just to highlight the yes.
We've just got 1 minute.
Okay. So air conditioner obviously is fall really far short of what's required. So without going into technical details, one can do the calculation for direct air capture, the poster child of IPCC, and the number, if we take into account what's needed to concentrate and condense CO2 and the actual heating induced atmosphere, it falls short by 1 order of magnitude. And another person proposed to increase latent heat transfer. And we can also do that calculation if we were to irrigate, all the landscape by making a lot of fresh water, then the efficiency for cooling is not very high. And we can also do a calculation for just making glass mirrors. That's what we are working on, to really directly eject part of incoming sunlight. Then the ratio at least seems to be perhaps compatible with what's required to make a difference on global scale. And it's 1,600 is not enough. And that's why we want to develop much more efficient building materials by going to using as little material as possible. And our latest thinking is to channel material that are currently going to the dumps and landfills, including plastics, aluminum cans, and glass, and also perhaps fugitive methane, in order to power the fabrication and installation of the whole infrastructure. And these numbers are what's needed to make enough reflectors to more or less cancel out the added radiative forcing from the CO2 emissions every year that we're currently outputting. So 50 gigaton CO2 equivalent. So I prepared this slide for material scientists, but we also worked with people in different disciplines, including one of the first heat officers in the global south, and also nonprofits seeking to ameliorate the life experience of people suffering from 50 plus extreme heat. And we'd like to encourage you to consider helping us and joining the effort. And I'd like to thank Roland Institute for initial funding, and also current members for their support.
Thank you very much, Yi. That's absolutely fascinating. Who would like to kick us off?
Yeah, could I have a go?
Please.
Yeah, let me just put a link in. It's all along the lines of small is beautiful, but I was in the Channel Islands just the other day. We're looking at, I think it's a big lacuna, shall we say, looking at heat networks on the one hand and cooling on the other. And, from in terms of ocean and marine cooling in particular, what Charlie Payton has been doing there for the last 20 years, to my knowledge, just he's an absolute purist, is really sort of low tech, basically using seawater to cool, using sunshine to take seawater and turn it into, basically to cool it with wind flows essentially, and the outputs are water, tomatoes usually or whatever, but it's really it's a really interesting technology, that one, in that it's really, really low tech and achievable pretty much now, but it's been adopted on a big scale by sort of venture capital and whatnot. In Australia, a massive, I think it was CSP they went for, to go for massive tomato warehouses. But the point is that using marine heating and cooling, it is possible to do huge amounts. But what you're doing is you're looking at the end of it. I'm going to come onto this myself. You're looking at the service and working back as to how you got there in terms of the least carbon fuel use. And that, to me, is the absolute necessity to deploy these sources, because everybody's looking upstream. Everybody's looking at energy. What people are not looking at is exergy. They're not looking at what comes out of the system and saying, how do we actually come up with a complete system that reaches that? And again, that one of the reasons for that is the legal and financial structures. But I'll stop there. Otherwise, you'll be taking 5 of my minutes, Rachel. So I'll stop that.
Thank you, Chris. Henrik?
I find this is a very good idea, and I totally agree with your assessment, both that probably there's a lot of locked-in warming already, then, and I would love to collaborate on this also from a professional point of view. Nonetheless, I'm starting to sound like Senator Cato here. I mean, in Rome about the necessity of destroying Carthage. I mean, still it doesn't in any way change the fact that, I mean, we have to stop emitting greenhouse gases out into the atmosphere. I mean, yes, we will need these solutions, but we have to sort of and the good way is, of course, if we could get the fossil fuel companies to pay for this through carbon tax, it would have a sort of a double effect.
Yeah. I'd like to respond to that excellent comment. So because of the limited time, we don't have time to really explain the whole framework. So obviously, anything that could be likened to geoengineering would have this more hazard problematic associated with them. So the thing with MEER is that if we think about it for a minute, actually it's a technique that favors a transition to more renewable energies. So one example, currently we're using silicon panels to capture 1 sun of incoming power. And then I think that's a very wasteful use of the PV photovoltaics, because the sunlight, even though it's hot for humans, it's not really hot from technological point of view. So one very simple way is to say, just focus 3 mirrors onto a single panel and somehow do your heat sinking better. It's very simply just attach it to a heat sink to some water tank that you capture both the thermal component and also the photovoltaic components, and you use 1/3 silicon. Yep. Right, so it's actually one way that catalyzes the transition rather than impedes it, as would say SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection, would surely do for any renewable energy.
Thank you. Carey?
I think Ye might have sort of answered my question, which was, how would you compare this to photovoltaics if someone was looking to make some mixed investment and aside from the land use kind of thing? I don't know if you have anything else to say. I mean, you could do their CROI of PV and CROI of mirrors and combine them, roughly speaking, but yeah, any other thoughts on it?
Yeah, so the thought is that there are different ways, so many different ways to capture solar energy, and we sort of are locked into in my opinion, one of the least efficient one, which is a standard rooftop PV. I mean, from an engineering, both equivalent emissions and also material use point of view, concentrating versions are far better, but early mover advantage sort of locked us in to this rooftop PV. So I don't think that's a really good thing. And also, traditional PV converts 8% of the light to heat, which exacerbates warming, actually. So I think we could do much better, and especially if we analyze residential energy consumption. So in the global north, 70%, anywhere between 60 to 80, depending on your particular location, is for heating purposes. So if we can co-capture that heat, then we can just be so much more efficient, not only in the two electricity conversion step, but also in the end use forms. And those discussions are not really being, are not happening much.
Thank you very much. Hugo?
Yes, hello, very great talks. I love this presentations. Just several, so many things, so many interesting things. And one point that I would like to make, I liked all the talks, but I liked in particular the last one by Ye Tao, because you have the right approach. The approach that you have to tell people to do something. Most of what is being said about climate change or climate destruction, as Henrik used the correct term, climate destruction, is that you should avoid doing something. It doesn't work. We have to tell people do something. And the engineering approach by Yetao is very interesting. I'm not sure how practically this alone it would not work, but together with other approaches, I am sure it is a good idea. And let me just mention the field in which I'm working right now. I'm trying to get interested into something that I will call ecosystem engineering, because the ecosystem, you can see it as an engineering system. It is there to keep temperatures stable. And you can you had a very, very interesting concept that cooling return for energy investment. Excellent idea. I love it. Now, the ecosystem can be leveraged to cool the planet by itself without you needing to do big investments in materials and things and mirrors also, because the ecosystem by itself cools the planet. Well, we know, and we're discovering it now, that forests cool the earth. It was not known, not just because of a question of albedo. Albedo is the opposite. Some people still think that forests heat the planet because their albedo is lower than that of a desert. So the consequence is you cut the forest, make a desert, and then you cool the planet. No, it doesn't work like that. Forests have a very sophisticated cooling mechanism, which is based on evapotranspiration, condensation at a higher heat in the atmosphere, which means that the heat is transferred from the ground to the upper atmosphere, and from there it goes to space, going through a thinner layer of greenhouse gases. So the whole effect, the overall effect, is cooling. And that's true also for the sea. The sea is an even more efficient, I think, way to cool the planet if we just add to the sea some whales. That's what we need. On the ground, you can put mirrors. On the sea, you must put whales. Your whales, the whales will mix the nutrients in the sea, increase the metabolic activity of the organism, which photosynthetic organism, and cool the planet. They could, I think, in principle, cool the planet a lot. And those, I think, we have several solutions, but the good idea, I think, is that tell people to do something. Don't tell them, don't do whatever you're doing. That doesn't work. You mentioned Yetao, I think, Henrik mentioned that the limits to growth was 50 years ago. And their mistake was telling people that they should not do something. No. It didn't work. You didn't expect it to work. So it is very good. We need to go out there and do something. And thank you very much for these excellent talks.
Thank you for the encouragement, and also bringing up the importance of the reason why we're doing these things. In the end, the goal is not to build mirrors. No, we're interested in rebuilding ecosystems and providing the habitat for the human animal. So improving forest coverage and also rebuilding marine ecosystems so that top predators like whales can thrive is our end goal. So I agree that planting trees and increasing irrigation forests can lead to heat loss by evapotranspiration. So the one thing that I recently only became aware of is papers from 2018 onwards have started to show that surface cooling by this mechanism actually have some negative consequences. One of which is when you partition the heat from the sensible, basically hot air component to the evaporative latent heat component, you actually reduce cloud cover. So there's a negative feedback there. When you have less clouds, you have actually more net production at ground level. So that's one thing to be aware of. The other bad piece of news that sadly came this year is our studies on the physiological impact on humans. Comparing the two stressors, one is moisture, basal humidity, the other is temperature. And it's found that while, yes, on a thermometer, you have a decreasing temperature when you increase evaporation, green roofs, etc. But from physiological human mortality perspective, you'd rather be better in a very hot but dry environment rather than a cooler and moist environment for the same total thermal energy content. So we need to be a little bit more careful on that front as well. But thank you. And we certainly need to do this, a CROI calculation for everything that's being proposed. I think it needs to become, a standard for climate mitigation proposals.